Uh, Good morning to any of those who might be listening. Uh, I wanted to cover off chapter 3 of uh, the text on eco social transformation and the economy. Um, the actual name of the text, sorry, is Eco-Social Transformation Community-Based Economy. I selected this, as you know, and I selected it for a specific reason. There's an awful lot in this chapter about uh, what are called mutual societies, co-ops, and foundations, the so-called third sector. This often appears in the literature as a kind of preferred option when it comes to finding ways of building a new political economy. Now, by political economy, I mean an economy that serves the needs of people. That's how I define political economy. That's a biased definition, I want you to know. Political economy in a general sense is just the arrangement of the economy and the political system that supports it. But my usage of that term now, anyhow, will focus on the social and solidarity economy that you find in this chapter. Now, they mention a number of things here that you might want to look into if you have any interest in social, economic, or political transformation. One of the sources they refer to here, which I think is quite important, and I've made reference to it in other reflections, is the World Social Forum. If you've never visited their site, I would take a look at it. It has been the focal point of and a focal point for people who want to resist neoliberalism and its related kindred approaches. You know, neoliberalism is an extreme form of capitalism, one might say, but there are other related forms. So this takes us to alternatives to what we might describe as classic capitalist economics, right? And we tend to carry in our heads, as I think we should at this point in time, neoliberalism. Because whatever people say about this, and people do say things about it, the idea that neoliberalism is dead, that it's been shattered and destroyed, through the pandemic or the crisis of 2008, I think all of that, to be quite frank, is wishful thinking. I wouldn't put a lot of stock in it. Capitalism has shown itself to be remarkably resilient. So that has to be kept in mind, right? The approach that you see in this chapter, in chapter 3 of this book, is for the most part focused on, as I mentioned, the third sector and local. There's a strong local emphasis throughout this chapter and throughout this book on economic and social transformation. There's an awful lot of emphasis on local approaches. And I want to question that, because I'm not at all convinced that we can achieve broad social, economic, and political transformation just at the local level. And therefore, there are a whole variety of reasons behind my saying that. And I want to talk in a few minutes about an approach that takes a national perspective rather than a local one, because I think we're going to need both if our intention is to transform our political economy, so our economics, our politics, our society. So we cannot create a utopia out of thin air, right? We need a plan. We need a strategy. In fact, we need an entire series of strategies. Now, when I talk about transformation, I'm talking about not reforming our politics and economics and our social institutions. I'm talking about replacing them with something new, something better able to meet human needs. So if you look at the social and solidarity economy, which is, by the way, an SSE, not an SES, we have a plethora of abbreviations in our world. At the very heart of the social and solidarity economy is the human being. So this approach that they describe in this chapter under the title of social and solidarity economy, this approach is replacing in my view, it's a transformative approach, and it sees itself as such. It is out to replace certain institutions with new institutions. So it's not altogether clear in this text what happens to capitalist enterprise in a world in which you have an emphasis on a social and solidarity economy. So it's not altogether clear that capitalist enterprise will be replaced. But it is clear that a good deal of economic activity will be shifted from capitalist enterprise to mutual societies, cooperatives, and foundations, right? And these are thought to be embedded in localities, hence my reference to local, local, local. There is a nice phrase they use to describe what they call the 0 mile ethos. Now, this is about locality, about the local. A 0 mile ethos means you're not transporting grapefruit from Florida to, say, Ottawa, right? Ottawa is fed through local farming communities and cooperatives, right? Is this type of economic vision possible? Of course it is. There's nothing that rules it out, but it would represent a substantial change in how we feed ourselves. And we should see transformation at this level. It is about communities and about entire nations, but it's also about individuals. It's about how we live our lives. So we're not spectators to this change. And the social and solidarity economy requires, I should say, much more participation from us. And that may be one of the principal challenges facing a social and solidarity economy. What it faces, and we've seen this, we've talked about it, what it faces is the heritage of liberalism, which, even in its non-neoliberal form, classical liberalism is about the individual. So when the social contract is established, it is individuals assessing their own private interests and advantage who decide how the contract will be shaped. I mentioned in, I think, the last reflection, there's no voice for the community in this. None. It's just one isolated individual after another. So it is from that perspective that the social contract is drawn up. So that puts us into the world of individualism right at the outset. And in that world, what kind of voice does community have? No, if what matters is the sanctity of the individual and the freedom of the individual, and it does matter, we all hold those values. It does matter. But if it's all that matters, then how do we ever get to a broader understanding of community, or for that matter, society? And remember here, at the neoliberal end, there is no society. It doesn't exist. And that has been stated, however counterintuitive that might be, because when I look out my window, I don't see individuals. I see a society, right? But Margaret Thatcher is renowned for saying only families and individuals. That's all that exists. There's no such thing as society. So once you find yourself in that world, it should come as no surprise that the only thing that matters to you is your own benefit, right? Why care about anyone else? Why have any broader vision of the social or public good? All that matters is what's good for me. And if it's good for me, then I infer it's good for everyone else, even though that inference has no foundation in reason at all. So this chapter gives us that kind of picture of a different type of social and economic arrangement, much more open to participation and emancipation as well, right? Why emancipation? Well, when you move people into cooperatives and mutual societies and foundations, they're no longer subject to the calculus of profit, right? So they're free to explore and to create. So that opens the door to human emancipation. There's more we can do. We have greater freedom to do it. Whereas in the classic capitalist vision, if we don't own the means of production, we work for someone who does, right? So ask yourself how much freedom you have in your working life. Now, maybe you have quite a bit, and that's a wonderful thing, credit to your institution or organization. But most of us follow orders, and most of us have our own ideas that are not heard. So organizations, most of us work inside organizations, and the bulk of economic activities inside organizations. So organization should be a fundamental unit of transformation. And we don't see that here in this chapter. It's something that I don't think they explore to the extent that they should. In the next few minutes, I'll talk about an approach that does explore it. So what you find in Richard Sennett, the sociologist, talks about this. What you find in neoliberal societies is the de-skilling of cooperative competencies. In other words, if we're all living inside our own individual spheres of interest and influence, then it's not at all clear that we have the opportunity to develop skills in cooperation, collaboration, right? Why would those skills matter? So these are thoughts that these authors are taking a look at. They make a reference to the UN Research Institute on Social Development, which I had mentioned in another reflection, and you might want to take a look at it. The other thing I think you should look at, if you're interested in transformation on a grand scale, take a look at the UN, the development goals. Take a look at them. I might bring them into the classroom next week. They're very important. They're developmental goals. There are, I don't know, 18, 20 of them. And I might bring them in. They're well worth looking at. If you look at them and step away from it and abstract from what you see, it should be very, very clear that if we're going to meet those goals by 2030, and I think that's an impossibility, to be honest, but if we were to do so, we would need to transform our economy, our politics, our approach to governance, our approach to managing society in a broad sense. What we would need is transformation right across the board. So the interesting thing about the UN development goals is it's not clear that the people who wrote them have an understanding of what they're up against, because there's this kind of very optimistic assumption that once you articulate these broad goals, people will recognize their value and start managing systems so as to achieve those goals. And I think that's wishful thinking. I have to be honest. The UN developmental goals are very important. They mark a direction. But I'm not at all convinced that the dominant elites of our time are at all interested in those things, right? And they tend to manage our affairs, those elites, right? I mean, think of the financial elites. If you want to know what I mean, if you need a concrete example, go back to 2008, right? Without substantial public investment to protect and preserve the financial sector, there would have been a worldwide collapse of the economy. There's little doubt about that. So the private sector in its most buoyant form in the financial sector, where there's been immense growth in the last 30 years, we had an explosion that would have destroyed the entire system. And what happened? Government bailed out the private sector. It's not the first time it happens all of the time. So you have private gain and public loss. So in other words, as we were making hundreds of billions of dollars through financialization in the FIRE sector, which is finance, insurance, and real estate, as major corporations were making billions of dollars, the entire system was moving towards collapse. And a fair number of the people inside that system were aware of where it was going. And when it collapsed, governments stood up and said, we'll help our partners in the private sector, and then bailed it out, and then spent the next 10 years with quantitative easing. In other words, driving public money into the financial sector to secure its health. So it's very interesting that at this point in our history, we bail out this enormous sector of our economy, and no one has anything to say about it. Right? We just saved all of those bankers, right? And they went on to record enormous profits, huge executive salaries. All of that is continuing. It's as if the collapse never happened. So, and it will happen again. I'm pretty convinced of that. If you know your Schumpeter, Schumpeter was an economist, who wrote about creative destruction in capitalism. And I would say 2008 was destruction. How creative it was is not at all clear, but it was destruction. There's no doubt about that. So so much for this chapter. I think if you're interested in transformation, it's something you might want to take a look at, because it covers off a number of topics that you see in the literature, right? When people talk about transformation of the economy, of the society, et cetera, they tend to bring up these types of ideas: local, cooperatives, the cooperative tradition. The authors talk about Italy and cooperatives in Italy. They have a long tradition in Italy of cooperatives. You see cooperatives in Germany and Spain and Canada, but the cooperative sector has never become prominent. So this type of approach would render it prominent, right? It would put the fire under the cooperative sector, and governments would look to feed the cooperative sector. That's the general idea. Now, what I want to close with is this text, which is written by Mariana Mazzucato. I think I have to put it that way. I've mentioned Mariana several times. I've read most of her work, and I think she has a very ambitious, but overall, I think, sensible approach to transformation. So I would encourage you, if you have an opportunity, to take a look at her book, Mission Economy. You can find her on YouTube. She's the one who talks about how public investment, and this book, Mission Economy, goes into that theme at length. What is she talking about? Very quickly, she's talking about, her example is the Apollo project. Put a man on the moon, right? That happened in 10 years. And when they started, they had no idea what they were doing. They just had an objective. They were told, put a man on the moon. And the entire book is about how that happened. And it shows that it happened because of a range of interesting changes that were adopted by NASA, and how NASA, for example, with respect to procurement, it had very special policies on procurement that we seldom see in government. And the policies were of this kind: we expect you to do X, here's the schedule, these are the objectives, get it done and you'll get paid. And they worked with thousands of corporations, universities, scientific organizations, and it's indescribable, in fact, to consider how much they had to do all at once. You had to design the machine, design the engine, design the fabrics, right? Keep everything as light as possible, because you have to move this object through space, right? So her point about this is we could design an economy that's mission-based, where we look to business and we say, here's our social objective. The social objective could be end poverty, right? So we would turn to private organizations and ask them for assistance in delivering a world without poverty. Now, it should be very clear here that the relationship is one of government telling business what it wants and how it wants it. Because nowadays, if you are close to government, you will know she's also written another book about the consulting sector in government. And if you know government, you'll know that the consulting sector has this strategic hold on government. There's no doubt about it. So how do governments go about meeting the needs of transformation, of building a new economy, a new society? They go to the consulting sector. And the consulting sector, here's the problem with the consulting sector. Its primary interest is its own profit. Why? Consulting houses are private businesses. And if there's something you should never forget, here it is. A private business seeks profit, and it has to seek it. There's no choice. It's the ultimate law of survival. So when push comes to shove, it's profit that matters to a private consulting house. They're also bastions of neoliberal thinking, as you would expect, right? A lot of these firms have dabbled in financialization. They're part of what has happened to our economy. So how much transformation can we expect from them? And this is an enormous problem no one discusses. In fact, I've tried to get the consulting budget for the federal government of Canada. It's impossible. So how much money do we spend every year giving projects to the Deloittes and IBMs and whatever out there in the consulting world? My guess is it's billions of dollars, and there's no calculation of value. In other words, we give them billions. What do we get, right? My point here is what Mazzucato argues is that our economy should be mission-based. So if you look at those, the goals of the UN, there are 18 or 20 of them. I can't quite remember. I'll bring them in. If you look at those, there's no doubt the only way you're going to achieve any of them is through a substantial transformation of our society and our economy. There's no doubt about that. And we have 7 years to do it. So there's something quite irrational about that. This idea that it has to be done by 2030. This is going to take us until at least 2080. It will take time, and it should take time. So why? We need to be careful about how we do it. So her notion of political economy pivots on the idea of public good, of the common good, so that rather than having private organizations seeking their own good, private good, her approach is to encourage or perhaps coerce private organizations, businesses, into serving the public good through these types of missions, right? Put a man on the moon, end poverty, end violence against women, whatever. And note, the government does not have to turn just to private businesses. It can turn to cooperatives. It can turn to other types of organization. The government is free to make that decision. There's no reason why it has to opt for Deloitte or IBM or some other elite firm. And they are elite firms. There's no doubt about that. If you know how they operate, they're pyramidal. It's an odd structure, but most of them are structured that way. So in the neoliberal picture or in the classic picture of capitalist economics, either one, governments fix markets. So when markets go bad, when they go wrong, government shows up and fixes the problem. 2008 is an example. Governments are fixing markets all of the time. And this is not often recognized. 2008 should be a very clear example of it. But how many people recognize 2008 as a failure in a private market? Right? That's what it was. Even it's the proponents of capitalism, some of them anyhow, will admit that. Even Alan Greenspan admitted it. So this is about, she mentions 7 pillars of a new approach. So her approach to transformation has 7 pillars, and she's aware of the UN development goals. You need a new approach to value. So value is not, should not simply be defined in terms of profit. Governments should shape markets, not simply fix them. And this is an odd statement because governments should shape markets. Governments do shape markets. The entire modern economy was shaped by government. You know, I mentioned this in other reflections, this idea that the economy just fell out of heaven and landed on earth, and here we are. That's a completely distorted picture of what happened. A much better picture is to be found in the work of Polanyi in The Great Transformation. The arrival of modern capitalism was a 200-year effort by governments. So markets do, governments do shape markets. I think she's talking about actively shaping markets, like making a deliberate choice to shape a market. Governments can do that as well. The other thing I wanted to say quickly about the Apollo mission is it had thousands of spillovers, what are called spillovers. I could list probably 100 of them. Think of things like fabrics, because the machine that took people to the moon had very special fabrics. She mentions the computer it carried. The module had a computer. It needed a computer. Well, computers at that time, in the 60s, early 60s, were enormous. So just the challenge of taking a machine that weighed tons and took up entire rooms to a machine that was maybe that large and weighed 70 pounds. That was an enormous engineering accomplishment that had spillovers all over the place. So her point is mission economy. As you're working on a mission, and this is quite true of the Apollo mission, as you work on it, you find benefits that extend well beyond the mission, that are applicable in a whole variety of areas. So in other words, working in this way, you're focusing on a specific goal, but the benefits often transcend the path to that goal. So she also mentions, and I think this is quite enlightened, she mentions organizations. Organizations have to transform. Governments have to transform. They have to be willing to experiment, to take risks, to support what is called patient financing, all of those things. And I can say from my 30 years in government, government is almost as far away from this as it could be. Our government on the inside is riddled with neoliberal thinking. It's all about efficiencies and accountabilities and value for dollar. When Kennedy announced the moon project, he admitted, I don't know how much it's going to cost, and honestly, I don't care. You know, I'm doing this because it's important. Our thinking, you know, if you think in terms of dollars and cents, you'll never get there, because you'll be asking yourself, oh, let me see, going to the moon, how much does that cost? And note, neoliberals, it's the first question they'll always ask. When you raise the elimination of poverty, oh, how much is that going to cost? When we spend trillions of dollars on foreign wars, no one has anything to say. That's all valid spending, right? Why? Because almost all of it goes to private enterprise, the defense sector. She talks about finance and the transformation of finance. I won't go into that. I've talked about 2008. Distribution. She talks about distribution of wealth and income. Partnership. There has to be a transformation in our notion of partnership. And participation is her seventh pillar. So these 7 pillars are pillars of transformation for Mazzucato. So need a transformation of value, transformation of markets, of organizations, of finance, of distribution and production, I should say, partnership and participation. So this gives us a kind of model, or the beginnings of a model of transformation. Now, what I'd like to do next week is take some of these principles and look at those social development goals, the UN, the development goals of the UN, and see how one matches up with the other. What I like about her approach, in contrast to the approach in the text that I discussed earlier, is this has a very broad national, it's not all about local. Local is important, but it's not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. So I'll talk about that in greater detail next week. It is interesting, she notes, and I'll close with this, just a private note. She notes that most of the economists who are proposing transformative approaches to political economy are women. And it is true. I've read a lot of them, and it's true. And I don't know quite why that is so, but it's an interesting fact. And the last point I'll make is her approach, Mazzucato, her approach is oriented towards transformation, but transformation in the broadest possible sense. So with that said, I'll close this off and I'll see you next week. I hope things are well.